Good afternoon. Welcome to this session. It's really about being interactive. So if you can feed question back, I'd say use the app, but the battery's about to die on the iPad, so it's not a foolproof system. So if you wave your hand around, we will have microphones. So that will be old school and great. Like a Ramones set circa 1977, we're going to cover a lot of ground in the next 30 minutes. Adele's truly high-tech, truly revolutionary, record-breaking in the round stadium tour. That's a lot of adjectives, but we'll try to deliver on all of those. The technology and versatility on and off stage at British Summertime Hyde Park, and the burgeoning esports event market in China. And to those ends, it's my great pleasure to introduce Richard Young, Adele's tour manager, who conceived a solution for getting that show truly in the round and with sort of good sound for all involved. Roger Barrett, Special Projects Director at Star Events, who designed the infrastructure to support the truly unique production and bring the crowd right in close where Adele wanted them. And Dan Craig, the Loudsound linchpin, is a core component of bringing the diverse best from British Summertime in Hyde Park. So if we backtrack and talk Adele, Richard, how did that sort of tour find its giant feet?
Well, unfortunately, we can blame the audio department for that. Having done a very successful arena tour, and obviously we all know Adele and we know what she's famous for, and what she's famous for is her great voice, her great songs, and also her banter. When we were in arenas, we probably overspent on speakers to ensure that every single seat had good sound, and we got very good reports from that. A lot of the feedback, a lot of the positive reviews were that it felt so intimate. She felt like she was talking to me because, I was her friend, that kind of thing. We also have to remember that Adele's audience are not your normal rock and roll audience. They probably don't go to gigs. They definitely don't go to football stadiums. And what they were expecting was a very high level of presentation. They've heard Adele on Radio 2, they've heard it on the CD or on their iPod, and they want to have the same experience when they're coming to a gig. So when we were talking about doing stadiums, and obviously stadiums are notoriously difficult in kind of doing sound or doing production or making anything intimate, the first thing we started with, where do the speakers have to go? Where's the best place to put the speakers to make it great for everybody? So I handed that question over to my audio department, and they came back with some hanging black boxes in kind of free space. That's where I could have done with some sky hooks. But what they decided was that there was a configuration of 8 hangs of speakers in the middle of the stadium, because then you're not using delays and everybody gets to be near enough the same distance away from a speaker as everybody else, because you're right in the middle. Now, we were looking at hanging these speakers in a 20-meter diameter circle at 25 meters in the air. So we were, this was a big ask, and the audio department knew that when they were going to give it to me, they said, this is what we really like. But, and I knew that they knew that they were going to be expecting compromises. However, I handed it over to Roger, I was expecting a bit of a, we can't do that, we can do this. What actually turned out is he returned with a solution, and we could achieve 25 meters up in the air, 20 meters in the round, 20-meter diameter circle of speakers in the middle of a stadium. Roger will tell you how we did it. However, once we started that, we were then looking at other problems and needing solutions. As you can imagine, if you've ever been to a gig, I'm sure we all have, there's a backstage normally, and backstage is where you put all the amps and the dimmers and all the junk and all that kind of thing. When you're playing in the round, there isn't a backstage. There's nowhere for anybody to hide. So as well as having the band in the middle, we traditionally you'd have the monitor desk in the middle, you'd have the amps in the middle, you'd have the dimmers in the middle, all that kind of thing. So what we came up with is for the amplifiers and the lighting dimmers, we put them in two 20-foot seat containers and we flew them in the roof above Adele. So obviously we were looking for a structure that was going to be proper and wasn't going to fall down. We were hanging, there was an awful lot of equipment in the roof over and above the lights and the video and the speakers. And then the second question, of course, is where do you put the monitor desk? Now, there is an option to put it underneath the stage, but by the time you've got a couple of backline guys, a quick change, somewhere for the backing singers to hang out when they're not singing, there's no space for a monitor desk. So we actually ended up putting the monitor desk and the video control 250 meters away in the bowels of the stadium. So that meant that we had to then connect the monitor desk and connect the video control by fibre because it was too far for copper. But of course, at that point, it doesn't really matter where they are because they can't see the stage anyway. So they're relying on speakers and headphones and video monitors to have a view of what's going on. And to be honest, if I could have got away with leaving them at home and running a fibre all the way from where they lived, we would have done that as well. So coming back to the stage and the structure, having then decided we were going in the round and we got rid of all this extra equipment by putting it in the roof or putting it in a bunker underneath the bleachers, then we could really think about how we could maximise the space and reduce the footprint of the structure so we get more people in, of course. The other thing we had to consider was what happens if it gets windy and it gets rainy. We were in Australia, we were outdoors everywhere, and obviously when we came to the UK, we were in Wembley, although when you play a full-size stadium, you do benefit from the weather protection of the walls. When we were in Australia, we had some venues which only had 3 sides, and although it was the summer in Australia, it still rains and the wind still comes. So we were looking at lots of different problems and trying to come up with brand new ways of doing things which didn't involve big grey sheets, storm bracing, lots of water ballast, lots of extra steel, because again, there was nowhere to hide all of that. When you play an end on stage, you've got loads of sided wings and backstage and underneath where you can put all that extra stuff to aid your structure. Well, I think at this point, I can hand over to Roger, who can explain how he did it.
Yes, thanks very much, Richard. Yeah, it was very interesting. What Richard hasn't mentioned is the timescales on this. The first discussion about, in fact, the first time I saw this plan to hang 24 tons of loudspeakers in the middle of the stadium was in July, and the test sort of production rehearsal was scheduled for December to take place in the UK, which, due to personal decisions by our esteemed clients, moved to the west coast of the States at very short notice. So we quickly determined, I think within about 4 weeks, that whilst we had a plan, there was no existing equipment that we were aware of, either that we owned or indeed any other staging company owned, which was capable of doing all the things that Richard's just mentioned. So we set out to modify what we already have, which we used to build lots of other stages, including the one for Dan's event in Hyde Park, which meant that we had a good starting point. We were just looking to modify existing designs. So we set up multiple design teams and multiple fabrication. In very simplistic terms, we fabricated everything that was horizontal, all the roof bits, in China, and we fabricated everything that was vertical in the UK, which meant that we had to ship, there were 2 systems, there were 2 identical systems, so we shipped half the equipment we'd made in China and half the stuff we'd made in the UK to the west coast of the States over Christmas, which is quite difficult to achieve from a practical point of view. Test assembled it in Phoenix, in Arizona, in January, well, in fact, over the new year. At the same time, the things we were learning, because this was the first time we'd ever actually put the 2 sets of equipment together from China and the UK, and it was interesting actually that our big concern was the interface, the components that actually joined the Chinese and the UK kit. So we had those made in the UK, the interface bits, and they were the only bits that were wrong. So we actually had to remake those in Phoenix. And that was enabling us to feed the info back to the UK and China to get the second system modified, because there was no time to do anything to it other than ship it straight to Australia. We then took the equipment that was modified in Phoenix and sent that to Australia as well. So it's all arrived with about 3 days to spare for the start of the tour in February, which was a very, very tight run thing. I think whilst it is still large amounts of steel, I think the things that kept me awake at night were the request to have nothing tying the legs of the stage together. So there already were 4 legs to start with, which means if one of them fails, there's a complete structural collapse. So the safety standards had to be extraordinarily high. And we couldn't tie them together at the bottom, and there was a specific request relayed from the client through Richard for there to be no tension bracing the guy wires that normally hold these kind of structures up. So we had to engineer our way around that. So we ended up with enough steel to fill 12 containers for each system, and we ended up getting it down to an install time of 20 hours, I think, in the end. We actually scheduled for 3 12-hour shifts on the tour with each system, but we did actually get it down to 20 hours, which we were quite pleased about. And it did actually all the things. We got the loudspeakers to within a centimetre of where the audio company had actually drawn them in the first place, which was a result. And we were heavily monitoring everything that was going on. So as we lifted the grid into position, we were actually lifting about 80 tonnes of horizontal grid prior to putting the production on, and then adding nearly 90 tonnes of production onto the grid. So every single aspect of that was monitored on load cells, and again the production was all on load cell monitoring as well. So there was no guessing. We had digital wind speed systems that were sending the actual real-time wind speed to the apps of all the key people on site and to a monitor on Richard's desk in the production office. It was all about using the technology to take the guesswork out. The key thing we kept reminding ourselves is that gravity works the same at every single gig, so we couldn't take any chances. Which would be a really good time to hand over to Dan, who uses very similar equipment, compatible equipment, in a completely different format.
Thank you. So yeah, British Summertime. I'm the operations director for that show. It is an event that we have now delivered for 5 years in London's beautiful Hyde Park. We came at this with a completely different view of what a festival should be, and indeed certainly what a city centre show should be. And I think probably primarily down to my kind of inner geek, we've tried to overload it with technology of every sort across the board. Richard's piece around the audio boys sort of driving the design brief was a very similar input for me. I think we all kind of know the history of the challenges of sound in Hyde Park, which now feel like we're talking about the dark ages, to be honest, because it's so long ago. But when we first started looking at how we were going to lay out the site and how we were going to make a point of difference back in 2013, we were looking to new audio technology, and then we were looking to Roger and Star to put that audio technology in the right places for us. So the kit itself is the MLA system from a manufacturer called Martin, and that is heavily reliant on processing to try and shape and constrain the sound field, and it does so remarkably successfully. For us, it's very easy. We want to keep the audio energy in amongst the audience, and we want it not to go over Park Lane onto the sensitive ears of our dear residential neighbours there. So that's been an amazing journey, and it's something that we continue to invest in and explore with the manufacturer. But tying that back into Roger's work as the staging company, the kind of counterpoint to that has been all about putting the right structures in the right place and designing structures that allow us to maximise the audience experience and minimise the amount of steel getting in the way. So very similar sort of challenge that I think Richard brought into the mix. And I think it was an unexpected Brucey bonus for me that some of the Adele kit at the end of the tour was able to be repurposed into a completely bespoke new PA support structure for my front of house tower that carried all sorts of different bits of production. It carried a PA hang, 3 remotely operated spots, so similar to Richard, being able to take the work at height risk out for a follow spot operator, being able to take the sight line obstruction of having a bloke in a covered shed dangling 12 or 14 metres up in the air out of the mix as well, and instead have them sitting in a cosy porter cabin safely at ground. Is a massive advantage. So again, there's a fibre connection, a camera, and 6 slightly confused follow spot operators trying to work out what the hell's happened. So we'll continue to probe into technology like that, and we think that's what makes the difference between a good show and a great show. And I think there's a really exciting arms race going on in terms of using new technology that is being carefully monitored and managed to get the most out of it. And delivering a commensurate benefit to the audience.
Your sort of the rod for your back there is that the answer is always yes, which was a great manifesto and one that everyone must have grimaced at as the years have gone past. But you've managed to deliver every last thing and be so versatile that you can have rock and roll one day and baseball the other, and in Hyde Park. And I don't think there's anywhere like that, certainly in this country, which can spin on its axis and deliver to such different audiences.
I wish I could say that was in the some of the artists and some of the madness that we've ended up delivering over the past 5 years were in the original design brief. They definitely weren't. There's been a little bit of juggling with some of the kit, but I think certainly the core staging product, the Vertec, which Roger's put in for us, and has time and again shown that we're able to accommodate very, very challenging, complex productions that should be on their own stage in a stadium environment. But we've opened the doors and allowed them to come into Hyde Park, which is clearly not a level surface, which has a whole range of challenges in and of itself. And quite often things that are supposed to be taking 2-3 days to be being built on an overnight shift as well. So the work that we did with Take That, which was tremendous fun, creating a special bespoke staging arrangement for them for the show, which was amazingly well received. But I think probably most impressively the Taylor Swift show of 2016, an incredible piece of stage engineering, again levelled, installed, tested, proved and successfully delivered on an 8-hour overnight call, and all that integrating into a fairly standard festival stage out the back.
And that's why that's reflected in the artists you get wanting to come and play there, because they can see that they can do actually what they want to do, which traditionally they would have to have their whole own setup and stuff to do. And I think that's a real testament to AEG Live and to the suppliers that provide for it.
Yeah, indeed. And, this year we've got, as you're probably aware, we've put Roger Waters on sale for 5th of July, little plug there. But yes. I think without giving too much away, we'll be pushing the stage and the site to even greater limits in terms of what we're doing. So look forward to that challenge.
Sorry, Richard, the impact of Adele and it being so dynamically different. There have been other artists playing in the round, but never like that, with someone really dependent on a piano and a voice delivered so equally around a stadium. What impact's that going to have, do you think, on the potential for other artists to explore that kind of technology? See the buzzword.
It's very good. Yeah, very
Thank
good.
you.
I think what we did, we set out to. All we were actually doing at the time was just delivering what Adele's ticket buying public were expecting, but by demonstrating we could achieve it, I think other people will be expecting higher standards, and not just the public, but the artists. When we were first talking to Adele 2.5 years ago, she was her reference points were concerts she'd been to, and I like how that sounds, and I really didn't like how this other thing sounded. And it's not that she understood the technology, but she was just expressing an opinion as a punter. And now we've demonstrated that you can do a show in the round successfully for a huge audience, and we were breaking attendance records all across Australia because we were selling every seat in the stadium, and we were filling the floor. We had seated floors in Australia. We were doing over 40,000 people just on the pitch on these in these cricket venues. That's an awful lot of white plastic chairs. But the end result is that the audio can be great, and you don't necessarily have to rely on delay speakers. You know, if you're playing an end stage, then you can only get 7,500 meters with your first hang of speakers, and then you've got to put a delay in, and obviously that's more steel. Sorry, Roger. More speakers, more sightline obstructions, and as soon as you put a second source of audio in, you're compromising the audio for some of the audience because they're hearing both speakers. In the round isn't for everybody. I'd like to say that Adele was the first artist that did a truly in the round show, and everybody says, yeah, what about U2? But of course, U2 was 360 degrees, but it was end stage, and they still had delays. The Foo Fighters at Wembley, I believe, was also 360, but it was end stage. And of course, if you're a band, and you're used to standing in front of a pedal board, then you want your point of reference, and you're always going to have people behind you. The good thing about Adele and the fact she's a solo artist is that everybody's looking at her. So I'm not advocating it for everybody, but I think there's great opportunities for dance acts, DJ acts, things where you're looking at the spectacle or you're looking at one person. We saw, while we were touring around, we saw a couple of boxing matches, and the boxing match obviously in the round, but the structure was relatively simple and lightweight. So here's an idea. Can you now take something you would see in Madison Square Garden or at Vegas? Could you take it outdoors, stick it in the round, and still deliver quality audio and quality video to all your punters?
I think it's an interesting point about the economic benefit. Clearly being able to sell tickets all the way around in the round made a huge difference. An end-on show, which, as Richard said, needs delays, you can't do that for obvious reasons. In fact, I noticed on the stand just here, there's a picture of the Hyde Park site with some of the delay towers quite clearly showing on it. And as an example of the design that's changed in the last 5 years that we've been delivering BST with Dan. 5 years ago, each of those delay towers, which had a certain number of loudspeakers on, needed a base that was 7.5 metres by 7.5 metres. That's roughly 53 square metres. If you think that you can sell tickets for 2 people for every square metre, that's 100 people that you've lost, never mind the area the barrier takes up and everything else. We've now managed, with some fairly tricksy engineering, to get the size of the base down to just 5 metres by 2.5 metres without losing height or capacity for the number of speakers, which is obviously a huge saving in space, physical space on the site. If you multiply that up by the 9 delays, they shouldn't say, 11 delays out on the site, that's a huge increase in real estate over the 5 years, and it's one of the great things of having a long-term contract, because I've been doing this for far too many years now, 40 odd, and most of the work we do, it's incredibly short term. We're dealing with people who want to know whether they can make a profit on a show in 2 weeks' time, and that's it, that's all they're interested in. It's really, really good to have something as long as a 5-year contract where there's an opportunity to constantly develop new things each year. It's been an absolutely stunning proving ground, and quite a lot of that design philosophy was directly applied then back into the Adele thing that enabled us to speed it up into the 4 months that we had between actually thinking about it and then actually delivering it.
We're nearly out of time. Any questions from anybody before we head quickly to China? Esports. Roger, it's back to you again, but what can you tell us about it. It's a massive market, is what I understand, and it's people playing computer games is the other thing I vaguely understand. How do the two?
I knew nothing about esports until about 3 or 4 months ago when we landed a fairly substantial contract in China to provide infrastructure support for Riot Games' League of Legends, for those of you that know anything about computer games. It was the World Playoffs and Finals. In very, very simplistic terms, it was 4 cities, 4 weeks in Wuhan doing the playoffs. These are professional level teams that have got their way through the online rankings. Then 4 nights in Guangzhou doing the quarterfinals, 2 nights in Shanghai doing the semi-finals, and 1 night that entirely filled the Chinese Olympic Stadium, the Bird's Nest, for the finals. We provided the physical infrastructure to support things. The Chinese event market is very similar to what was happening in Europe in the 80s and 90s before all the purpose-built arenas happened that only were large sports venues, and that's what's happening in China. So you can't rig shows in an arena style, which is great for people like us because we're back in there with the same technology that we had in the 1980s here, ground support systems and things. I've never seen a show with as much production, infrastructure, technology or anything else as the finals in the Bird's Nest. We had to redesign the original plan to actually get it to fit in the Bird's Nest Stadium, which is bigger than our Olympic Stadium. I don't have the figures for this year. I know that last year the final, or the heats in the final, paid out $60 million in prize money. And they had 174 million people watching on streaming services for the finals, which are played by 2 teams of 5 people, most of whom looked as though they really needed to have a chaperone with them due to their age. That's probably just me being a bit old for this kind of thing now. And the presentation quality is what you would expect to see in a major TV studio. So nice edges to a stage like this were done with real glass, with LED lighting behind it, on just a vast scale, virtually the whole field of play, for minutes of opening ceremony. In Hyde Park, there's nearly 1,000 square metres of screen across the stage for British summertime in total. The relay screens, which were at the back of the main stage area for these 2 teams to play on and the live audience to watch, were just under 2,000 square metres of screen, just for the live audience to watch. They put tickets on sale, and in China, the game's actually owned by a Chinese company now, one of the 3 big media groups in China, Tencent. The tickets were very, very cheaply priced because it's not about, at that level, making money from tickets. They sold out in 27 minutes, the entire stadium, and within 5 minutes they were on, the ticket price was, 5 or 6 quid, and within half an hour they were on resale sites for over $3,000. It's an absolutely astonishingly huge market.
And so one day in Hyde Park we could be watching people play computer games.
Sounds like we haven't got a big enough screen. Right? Let's get a bigger stage. Well, we had a go at baseball this summer, which was an unexpected addition to our events programme.
That went fantastically well.
Well, all good. Yeah, so we'll give it a go. Yeah,
fantastic. Richard, Roger, Dan, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.